Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into the marvelous world of tanking or being a vanguard. Now if you're just getting into Marvel Rivals or this is your first time playing a game like this, then this video is probably going to be pretty helpful to you, covering things like positioning, tactics, and even decision making. And if you want to know specific guides to specific vanguard heroes in this game, make sure to subscribe. I have a ton of other hero guides in the works and already posted, so you might as well stop by. Now this video is going to be split into a few different categories. Now a lot of other content creators have also created videos like this, and I've also created one already exactly like this quite a while ago. This is a refresher for everyone, or if you're coming new to Marvel Rivals. Now we have a few different categories. The first one, I'm explaining what is tanking or what is being a vanguard. Then we have concepts like making space, managing attention, creating pressure, and even peeling, as well as forcing fights. With that being said, I hope you sit back and relax. Now tanks or vanguards in Marvel Rivals are placed into a few different categories. You have things such as main tanks, off tanks, dive tanks, or even something else. Depending on the team composition, your role will slightly shift. However, at the end of the day, all tanks, regardless of what category they're placed in, all follow the same principles. That is, of course, making space, drawing attention, creating pressure when necessary, peeling to help your backline, and sometimes even forcing fights. Making space is at the core of effective tanking. It's what separates a great tank from a passive damage sponge. Many players assume that making space is just about standing in one spot and blocking enemies, but it's actually much more dynamic than that. It's about controlling where fights happen, who fights where, and how much freedom your team has to execute their strategy. But what does making space actually mean? In simple terms, making space means creating room for your team to operate while restricting the enemy's options. This is done through positioning, movement, and aggression. It's about applying pressure in a way that forces the enemy to react, rather than letting them dictate the pace of the fight. Now, believe it or not, this space is both a physical and psychological factor. Let's talk about what I mean by the physical space. It's the actual map areas you occupy or deny the enemy access to, while psychological space, for whatever reason, people don't actually seem to understand this, or it lays kind of dormant in your mind when you're playing the game. But psychological space is the perception of danger and pressure that makes the enemy hesitant to engage or forces them into suboptimal positions. And let me tell you, there definitely is a sort of intimidation factor. When tanks on the other team start to get a whole lot more aggressive, you start thinking if there's heroes on the other team that are going to be flanking you, and you having that intimidation factor could make you miss your shot, miss your heal, and allow the enemies to easily push you. Now, by controlling space effectively, you allow your damage dealers and supports to operate freely while limiting what the enemy can do. Now, you're probably wondering, how do tanks actually make space? Well, there are different ways to create space depending on the type of tank you're playing. For example, you kind of have like an aggressive engagement or a dive composition. What you do is pushing into enemy lines and forcing them to reposition and react to you. Dive tanks like Venom or Hulk do this best by disrupting the backline and scattering enemies. Then of course you have slower tanks like Dr.Strange or Magneto that can create space by stepping forward and contesting key areas. Now, different tanks can definitely be used, but these are just examples. Now, another way tanks make space is choke point control, holding or contesting critical map location like doorways, corridors, or high ground. A main tank like Magneto, Dr. Strange, and you can even throw Penny Parker in there excel here by using shields and bodies to block enemy movement. The whole point of this is to deny easy entry points and force enemies into bad positions. Now, another way tanks make space is by disrupting enemy formation. Breaking up the enemy's positioning makes them vulnerable to focus fire. For example, you could have Thor who pushes a key target out of formation, creating an opening for your team. Now, you also have characters like Groot that can really displace and mess with enemies. Now, another method of creating space is zone control, threatening key areas. Even without directly engaging, tanks can create space just by being a threat. I will say most of the time having a vanguard or tank players standing on high ground typically forces enemies to respect that space. Now, you're probably sitting here thinking, cool, but why does this matter? Now, making space matters because it enables DPS to secure kills. Without space, damage dealers can't take optimal angles or follow up on opportunities. Now, it also protects your team's supports or strategists. Healers are easier to focus if they have nowhere safe to play from. It also forces enemies to make mistakes. When pressured, enemies panic, misposition, or waste resources, making them a whole lot easier to eliminate. And you also control the flow of the battle. Tanks dictate where and how fights happen, setting the pace for the entire match. Now, with that being said, there are some common mistakes in making space. One mistake is being too passive. If you're just sitting back and absorbing damage without contesting space, the enemy has full control, and you're kind of just like a used sponge. You absorb some damage, but you don't really do anything. Now, another major common mistake is overextending. If you push too deep without support, you can become an easy target and feed ult charge. Another is ignoring your team's needs. Making space isn't about diving alone, it's it's about coordinating with your team to create opportunities. Now for our last common mistake, this is probably the biggest one I see in Marvel Rivals, and that's forgetting to disengage or knowing when to disengage. Making space doesn't mean holding it forever. You need to know when to back off and reset even if your team isn't ready to follow up. Now making space is one of the most understood but underutilized aspects of tanking or being a vanguard. A great tank isn't just a damage sponge. They're a battlefield controller who decides where fights happen and how they unfold. Whether you're leading an aggressive push or holding a defensive line, always think about how your positioning, pressure, and movement shape the battlefield for your team. And if you're finding this video useful so far or entertaining, make sure to hit that like and subscribe button. It greatly helps me out. Now, one of the most overlooked but crucial skills in playing a tank is managing attention. Now, being a tank isn't just about absorbing damage and making space. It's about controlling where the enemy is looking, who they're focusing on, and how they react to your presence. A tank that efficiently manages attention can manipulate enemy decision making, enabling their team to act freely while keeping key threats occupied. But let's break down why attention management is important, how to control it, and the different playstyles that influence enemy focus. So why does managing attention matter? First, they take pressure off key teammates. If enemies are too busy dealing with you, your DPS and supports get some breathing room to make plays. It also creates distractions for openings. If enemies are focused on you, they may ignore flankers or objective plays happening behind them. You also force mistakes and cooldown usage. When you draw attention, enemies might panic, waste abilities, or break formation. You also get to set the pace of the fight. Now, if you can control where enemies are looking, you can dictate engagements on your terms. Without proper attention management, a tank becomes ineffective, either ignored completely or focused too easily without value. And trust me, for my tank players out there, sometimes you might feel useless. First, how do you manage attention? You need to be a threat towards the enemies. Enemies naturally focus on whatever is most dangerous to them. Tanks with high burst damage, crowd control, or strong dueling abilities demand attention just by existing. So aggressive dive tank like Venom, Hulk, or even Thor jump into backlines, forcing enemies to deal with them. Whereas you have, kind of brawler-ish tanks, where again, that's kind of like Hulk, Captain America, Thor, where they use high damage tools to make ignoring them a deadly mistake. Now, sometimes a tank doesn't need to be a direct threat. They just need to be annoying. Tanks with some sort of displacement ability, like Groot, force enemies out of position, breaking their focus. Barriers, walls, and zoning tools make enemies deal with obstacles instead of the actual target. And constant repositioning forces enemies to track you instead of your teammates. The whole idea is to distract and frustrate enemies so that they waste time and resources on you instead of the real threats. And I think a character or a hero or tank or vanguard, whatever you want to call it, that excels at this role super effectively is actually Captain America. Now, believe it or not, using body language and positioning is also a major factor. Even without abilities, tanks can control attention just by where they stand. Standing in open sight lines forces enemies to shoot you instead of teammates. That's pretty self-explanatory. Holding an off angle makes enemies split their forces between you and your team. Then you have peeking in and out of cover. This constantly forces enemies to keep checking your positioning. A well-positioned tank generally commands some respect, even if they aren't actively attacking. Now, don't get me wrong, good tanks don't just take all the attention, they redirect it to create advantages. When do you know when to take attention? When your team needs space or safety, you absorb focus by standing in open areas, using abilities, or diving into enemies. But on the flip side, how do you know when to actually redirect it? Typically, you want to redirect the attention when you want teammates to make plays. You bait focus away by repositioning, disengaging, or drawing enemies toward a trap. Now, typically, a great tank knows when to be the center of attention and when to let their team shine. And again, hopefully this video is helping you in some way, shape, or form. Now, another important skill in tank play is creating pressure. A great tank doesn't just absorb damage, they make the enemy feel uncomfortable, restricted, and constantly under threat. Pressure isn't just about damage output, it's about forcing enemies into bad positions, making them waste resources, and disrupting their plans. The more pressure you create, the harder it is for the enemy team to execute their strategy. So why does creating pressure actually matter? It matters for a couple reasons. First, it forces enemies to react. The more pressure you apply, the less time enemies have to think and coordinate. It also limits enemy movement. When you take space aggressively, enemies are forced to reposition or risk getting caught. It also disrupts the enemy's focus. Pressure makes enemies panic, breaking their aim and coordination. It also enables your team. A tank that applies pressure gives their DPS and supports more freedom to make plays. Without pressure, the enemy team can play comfortably, making it harder for your team to succeed. Now, how tanks create pressure is kind of like how they take space space as well. The first one with being aggressive positioning and forcing enemy movement. Tanks create pressure just by where they stand. By taking space early and holding key angles, you can control where the enemy can go. Typically, you want to hold corners aggressively, forcing enemies to pre-fire or take longer routes. Blocking off chokes makes enemies waste time or risk fighting at a disadvantage. A well-positioned tank sometimes makes enemies feel boxed in and uncomfortable. Now let's talk about threatening damage or demanding respect. Even if a tank isn't a DPS, they can still create pressure through constant, consistent damage. Tanks with burst damage like Groot, Venom, or sometimes even Dr.Strange force enemies to respect their space. Tanks with poke keep enemies under pressure even before fights starts. Whereas you have sustained damage makes it dangerous to stay in one spot for too long. The more enemies fear taking damage, the less confidently they can play. And I will say in Marvel Rivals, a really good group player can be rather scary. I think just like managing space and managing attention, managing pressure also has a psychological aspect. By making enemies fear you, pressure isn't just about mechanics, it's also about mind game. Tanks with a strong reputation make enemies play scared. For example, if you had a Groot on the other team, you might be a little bit more hesitant to dive into the enemy backline with the fear that you could get walled off from your supports or just walled off from any help in general. Now, constant aggression makes enemies second guess their movements. If you're playing a Vanguard or a tank and you're aggressively applying pressure, most of the time enemies are going to be playing a little bit scared or hesitant. And honestly, because of that, the time you don't apply any pressure, they might have no idea what you're going to do, which aligns into the unpredictability aspect. Mixing up dive patterns, faking engages keep enemies on the edge. When an enemy expects danger at all times, they play passively, giving your team the upper hand. Now, just like when it comes to attention, you also need to know when to apply versus relieve pressure. Pressure is powerful, but it must be used wisely. Knowing when to apply pressure and when to let up is key to controlling fights. Typically, you want to apply pressure when you want to create openings, break enemies' focus, or force bad decision. While on the flip side, when you're relieving pressure, when your team needs to regroup, or when baiting enemies into overextending. A masterful tank knows how to push at the right time and reset when needed. Now, peeling is one of the most important yet underrated aspects of tanking. Many players assume that a tank's job is just to push forward and take space, but that's really only half the story. A truly great tank knows when to engage aggressively and when to turn back and protect their teammates. Peeling is about protecting your backline, saving teammates from danger, and ensuring your team can function without being overwhelmed. A tank that masters peeling can single-handedly turn fights in their team's favor, yet somehow no one in Marvel Rivals knows how to do this. So what is peeling? Peeling is the act of diverting, blocking, or eliminating threats targeting your teammates. The goal is to prevent enemies from pressuring or eliminating your supports and damage dealers. Now, why is peeling important? First and foremost, it keeps supports alive. If your healers die first, your team has no sustain and will quickly fall apart. It also protects your damage dealers because DPS heroes need space to operate and peeling keeps enemies off of them. Now, it also disrupts enemy engagements. If you stop a dive or flank before it succeeds, you'll instantly turn the fight in your team's favor. It also buys time for counterplay. A peeled teammate can reposition, heal up, and get back into the fight instead of dying. Peeling, in simpler terms, is essentially team protection, ensuring that your key teammates survive long enough to win the fight. But how do you peel as a tank in Marvel Rivals when no one ever uses their voice chat? Now, peeling doesn't just mean turning around and hitting an enemy, it's about using your kit to neutralize threats before they become fatal. To peel effectively, you need game sense to recognize when a teammate is in danger. Typically, you want to watch for dive heroes engaging your back, characters like Black Panther, Hulk, Psylocke, Spider-Man, Magic, any dive hero. Pretty much. And you also have to watch out for flankers trying to assassinate your supports as well. Again, a character like Psylocke or even Black Panther. You also have to be aware of enemy tanks pushing past you to disrupt your team. And if you have a character like Hela, Black Widow, or Hawkeye harassing your DPS or healers as well. Peeling requires awareness. You should always track enemy movement and anticipate where the danger is coming from. So once you recognize the threat, you need to mitigate its impact using positioning and ability. I think one thing that separates a mediocre tank from, a very skilled tank is actually body blocking. Physically putting yourself between the enemy and your teammate to absorb damage, and honestly, you doing that might literally be the difference between winning the game and losing the game. Now, not only that, but you also have shields and barriers protecting squishy teammates from lethal shots. Now, you also have knockbacks and displacement if you're playing a character like Magneto, pushing enemies away from your support, as well as some crowd control or CC abilities, stunning or slowing enemies to prevent them from killing your backline. Because the longer you have your backline up, the longer you'll be able to maintain being in the front. Now something that I see a lot of people not talking about is actually counter diving and focusing the attacker. Peeling isn't just about defense. Sometimes the best way to protect your teammate is by eliminating the threat. If, for example, Psylocke dives your backline, a well-timed counter dive from your tank can force her out. If a DPS is harassing your support, turning to focus them down makes them think twice. And if an enemy tank charges into your team, forcing them back prevents them from creating space. Peeling is about making the enemy pay a price for diving your team. Now probably a question you have for me is, Duck, when should you peel? Well, peeling is all about balancing aggression and defense. If you peel too much, you risk up giving space. If you ignore your team's needs, on the other hand, they'll die before you can even win the fight. So what are the key situations to peel for? One being your healer is under attack. Supports are your highest priority to keep you alive. Or maybe you have a DPS that is being flanked. A dead DPS means lost kill potential. Or maybe a key enemy ability is about to land. Blocking it can change the fight. Or if your front line is stable enough, if your team doesn't need you forward, focus on the back line. Knowing when to switch between frontline aggression and offensive peeling separates average tanks from elite ones. Now let's talk about some common peeling mistakes. One mistake is tunneling on the front line. If you never look back, you'll never see that your teammates are actually dying. Especially in Marvel Rivals when no one ever uses their voice comms, so you don't know they're actually getting dived. You might need to pull off a 180 here and there to see how your backline is doing. Now another mistake that I see is there's something as over peeling. If you're constantly in the backline, the enemy frontline will overrun your team. So if you're spending too much time in the backline, you probably need to move up. Another major thing is not tracking threats. And another thing is not tracking threats. If you don't know where the enemy divers are, you can't react in time. That's why pinging is actually a very crucial mechanic in Marvel Rivals. You can ping with your middle mouse button if you're playing on a mouse and keyboard, so it's definitely something I recommend you should be aware of. Now, one last common mistake is wasting abilities too early. Holding your CC or crowd control abilities. If you don't know what crowd control or CC is, that's perfectly fine. It's something like a stun, a root, a knockback, or anything like that. Now, a great tank balances aggression and protection, knowing exactly when to push forward and when to turn back. And if you're finding this video helpful in any way, shape, or form, I do have to ask, please do me the favor of hitting that like and subscribe button. It's the best way to support my channel and to keep this thing going. Now, our last topic is about forcing fights or controlling the tempo of battle. Now, forcing fights is one of the most powerful tools in a tank's arsenal. Now, as a tank, you're not just a damage sponge, you're a battlefield leader who decides when, where, and how engagements take place. A well-timed force fight can break stalemates, disrupt enemy formations, and give your team a decisive advantage. Many players wait for the perfect moment to engage, but great tanks create those moments. Understanding how to force a fight at the right time in the right place and under the right conditions is what separates passive tanks from game-changing tanks. So what does forcing a fight actually mean? Now, forcing a fight means intentionally initiating combat on your terms, rather than waiting for the enemy to make a move. It's all about taking the initiative, dictating when the fight starts instead of reacting to the enemy. Controlling positions, forcing the enemy to fight in an area that benefits your team. Capitalizing on enemy weaknesses, engaging when the enemy is out of position or missing cooldowns, and last but certainly not least, it's creating chaos and pressure, making the enemy scramble to respond rather than executing their strategy. When you force a fight correctly, you set the tempo and make the enemy play reactively. But why is forcing fights so crucial? Many teams struggle because they hesitate too long, allowing the enemy to set up defenses, poke for damage, or gain ultimate charge. A tank that proactively forces fights can break defensive formations. A well-timed push can collapse enemy setups. You want to take advantage of enemy mistakes, catching opponents off guard, make it easier to eliminate key targets. You want to prevent enemies from regaining control. The more pressure you apply, the harder it is for them to recover. It also gives your team some sort of confidence. A decisive tank can encourage teammates to follow up and commit to fights, something that rarely anyone does in Marvel Rivals. Forcing fights is especially important in objective-based games where waiting too long can mean losing a point, payload, or even match. But how do you effectively force a fight? Well, not every force fight is a good one. Now, the best engagements happen when you recognize the right moment to strike. So here's how you can force fights intelligently. Now, first, you don't want to jump in blind, so you need to look if enemy cooldowns are burned, if key ultimate abilities like healer's escape or a tank's defensive tool is down. You also want to be looking for enemies that are out of position. If a DPS or support is caught alone, force a fight before they can even retreat. And if you have a numbers advantage, say a 6v5, I always recommend immediately pressing the fight. That's not all, you also have to think about the ultimate economy. If your team has more ultimates ready, forcing a fight can secure an easy win. Now, for example, if you see that an enemy support just used their healing abilities or a DPS just burned a movement skill, that's more than likely your cue to charge in and start to fight before they can actually recover. Now you should also be doing your best to force the enemies to waste resources. Now forcing a fight doesn't mean going all in immediately. Sometimes it's about making the enemy panic and waste key abilities. So you could step forward and bait out cooldowns. If you push up and the enemy uses defensive abilities too early, back off and then engage after they're vulnerable. You also want to pressure backlines to force some sort of movement. If you threaten their healers or, snipers like Hawkeye or Hela, they'll have to reposition, breaking the formation and making it super easy to engage on. And this is a good rule of thumb for low ranks and even higher ranks, is that you want to use soft engages to test their reaction. Try pretending to push in, see what they burn, then fully commit when they have nothing left. Once the enemy has wasted their key resources, that's when you hard commit and secure the fight. Now with that being said, there's always common mistakes with anything, especially when it comes to forcing fights. One common mistake is engaging too early. If your team isn't positioned or ready, your engage would fail. Or if you're forcing a fight in a bad location, fighting in an open space with no cover can get your team pretty much wiped. Another thing is overextending without backup. A tank that dives too deep alone is just a free kill for the enemy. Another mistake is ignoring ultimate economy. Forcing a fight when the enemy has all their ultimates and your team doesn't is a fast way to lose. Another thing is not committing fully. A hesitant engage confuses your team and wastes an opportunity. This is another thing you can tie with some psychology. If you're hesitant and don't have confidence, you're more than likely prone to not fully committing. Instead, if you're going for a dive, you have to be confident and just fully commit. The best tank knows when to fully commit and when to bait out resources before diving in. Now with all that being said, that's pretty much a detailed explanation of the basics of tanking. Now if this helped, be sure to hit that like and subscribe button, as it's the best way to support this channel. I can't thank you all enough for the incredible support, and if you also want to support the channel, maybe become a YouTube member. It's another way to greatly help me out, but regardless, I can't thank you all enough for watching, and I hope you have a great day.